The date is April 16, 1846, and with a slow lurching start, 9 wagons begin the 2,500-mile journey from Springfield, Illinois to the American West Coast in California. Split up into family groups, 87 would-be settlers are led by businessman James Fraser Reed. He's following in the footsteps of a great migratory rush to the West Coast and has plans to strike it rich by claiming his own stake in California. Traveling with his wife Margaret, he also hopes that the sea air and living on the coast will help his wife's terrible migraines. To prepare for the journey west, Reed has read a new book put out by Lansford W. Hastings, The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In the book, Hastings advertises a shortcut over easy terrain that could slash 340 to 400 miles off the trip west. Hastings' route, however, has never actually been tested and is purely speculative. In fact, Hastings hopes that he can build a business empire by rerouting settlers through this route to Sutter's Fort, or modern-day Sacramento. Setting forth on a doomed route, Reed begins his journey with 32 other settlers, including the Donner, Graves, Breens, Murphys, Eddies, McCutcheons, Keysburgs, and Wolfingers families. They also bring along 7 teamsters and several bachelors. Reed and his wife are accompanied by their 4 children, Virginia, Patty, James, and Thomas, as well as Margaret's 70-year-old mother, Sarah Keys, and 2 hired servants. Sarah is so afflicted by consumption, however, an old-time diagnosis for modern tuberculosis or a number of other diseases and ailments, that she can hardly even walk. Reed, who has been to date very successful in business, is convinced though that the new route will be an easy one, and that he and his family will not have to suffer the rigors of travel for very long. In preparation for their trip, he has ordered an extravagant 2-story wagon with a built-in iron stove, spring-cushioned seats, and individual bunks for each family member to sleep in. The giant cart takes a whopping 8 oxen to pull, and Reed's daughter Virginia dubs it the Pioneer Palace Car. The group estimates that the trip will take 4 months to cross the vast plains of the American Midwest, followed by the deserts leading up to the mountains, and then finally through the mountains to the West Coast. Their first stop on this journey is Independence, Missouri, which is the main jumping-off point for both the Oregon and California trails, the main thoroughfares for travelers moving out west. The group has no idea, but on that very same day that wagon train moves west, Lansford Hastings himself is setting off east from California, eager to see what the shortcut he had written about in his guidebook was actually like. The wagon train began to pick up other families as it moves further and further west, swelling its numbers. On May 12th, the party left Independence, Missouri in the middle of a thunderstorm, an ill omen for what's to come. Just a week later, though, they joined with another wagon train led by an American cavalry colonel and continued pushing west until being held up by very high waters at the Big Blue River in Kansas. Here, the party experienced its first death, with Reed's mother-in-law, Sarah Keys, dying. She was buried next to the river, and the party then built rafts to float their wagons across the river. Things were going as planned, and the expedition reached Fort Laramie in Wyoming just a week behind schedule, on June 27, 1846. There, though, James Reed ran into an old friend from back home in Illinois, who had just finished traveling with Lansford Hastings as he made his way east from California to test that route he himself had published but never actually used. Reed's friend warned him not to take the trail, telling him that the road that existed was barely passable on foot and would be impossible to cross with wagons. He also warned him of the vast desert and the tall Sierra Nevadas he would have to cross, and strongly suggested that the entire wagon train take the old, well-used trail to California. Reed, however, ignored the warning, and determined to get to California as quick as possible, set off on Hastings' false trail anyway. The group reached the Continental Divide on July 11th, and there they were met by a man carrying a letter from Lansford Hastings himself. In the letter, Hastings assured the group that he would meet them at Fort Bridger and then lead them personally through his route. While doubts of the Hastings route had begun to permeate the group, especially after the dire warning received in Fort Laramie, the group's fears evaporated at the thought of Hastings leading them personally on the unproven trail. 8 days later, the group arrived at what is today Little Sandy River in Wyoming, and here the trail split off in 2 directions: the traditional northerly and longer route, and the unproven Hastings Trail that promised to shave weeks off their travel time. The group of settlers argued amongst themselves about which route to follow, and at last the majority of the wagon train decided to go north along the safer and well-known route. The minority took the Hastings cutoff and elected George Donner as their new captain. The group reached Fort Bridger on July 28th but found no sign of Hastings, save for a letter saying that Hastings had already left, along with another group of emigrants, and that the wagon train should catch up. The group rested here for a few days, making repairs to their wagons and stocking up on supplies, believing that only 7 more weeks lay between them and California's sun-drenched coast. On August 6, the group reached the Weber River and discovered another note left behind by Hastings. In this note, he warned the group not to follow him through Weber Canyon as the route said to do, because the canyon had become virtually impossible. He implored them to take a different trail through the Salt Basin, and then the two groups could link up. James Reed and 2 other men rode ahead on horses to find and catch up with Hastings, which they did on the south shore of the Great Salt Lake. Hastings then accompanied Reed only part of the way back in order to point out the new route the wagon trail should take, and once more encouraged them on their way. Amongst the pioneers, though, faith in Hastings' trail was fading and a vote was taken, with the majority opting to try the new trail rather than backtracking. This would be a fatal mistake. The way forward proved arduous and difficult, with the group forced to clear trees so that their wagons could pass through. The group was making less than 2 miles a day, and eventually they were forced to abandon some of their wagons and the supplies that they carried. The pioneers began to blame Hastings, and morale sunk even lower when on August 25th, the caravan had another death to consumption, Luke Halloran. By now, there was a real fear that they would not make it through the mountains before winter began to set in, as in 21 days the group had made it only 36 miles. Supplies were running low and fall was rapidly approaching. On August 30th, the pioneers made it through the thick forests and set out on the Great Salt Lake Desert. According to Hastings' guide, the trip would only take 2 days, but what the pioneers didn't realize is that the desert sand was very moist and deep, bogging down their wagons. Not only was their progress severely slowed, but on the 3rd day their water supply was almost completely out. A number of oxen had also run away and others had died. The group was forced to abandon even more wagons, and a trip that was supposed to have taken 2 days to cross 80 miles had taken 5 days. On the day the party made it out of the desert, an inventory of the food discovered that the supplies were dangerously low. Even more ominously though, that very night the first snow fell on the mountains, covering the peaks with a fine layer of white. The group sent 2 men, William McCutcheon and Charles Stanton, ahead to Sutter's Fort in California in order to bring back supplies, for without them, the party would never make it through the mountains. On September 26, the group finally reached the original path laid out by Hastings and his guide, though the detour Hastings had himself pointed out to them in person had added 125 miles to their route through very difficult mountain and desert terrain, exactly the type of terrain that Hastings' original route had promised to avoid. Resentment of Hastings and even Reed was now bordering on full-blown mutiny, but the group pushed on regardless. Tempers flared, however, and on October 5th, 2 wagons became entangled, and the first act of violence visited the caravan. John Snyder, the teamster of one of the wagons, became frustrated and began to whip the helpless oxen. Reed ordered Snyder to stop, but when he wouldn't stop, Reed grabbed his knife and stabbed the teamster in the stomach, killing him. The group voted on how to mete out justice, and though some favored hanging Reed, no doubt helped along by their resentment of his choice to lead them on the Hastings Trail in the first place, in the end, Reed was banished from the wagon train. He left his family behind and rode off to the west with another man, never to be seen again by the group. The Donner Party pressed on through the Humboldt River, and in an attempt to ease the burden on the thoroughly exhausted animals, everyone who could disembarked their wagons and walked. 2 days after the death of Snyder, an older Belgian man was turned out of Louis Kiesberg's wagon and forced to walk. The elderly man had severely swollen feet and was unable to keep up, and thus he knocked on the doors of every other wagon but was turned away each time. The last anyone saw of him, he was left sitting under a large sagebrush, completely exhausted and unable to walk. The group left him behind to die alone. On October 16th, the exhausted and beleaguered group finally reached the gateway to the Sierra Nevadas in what is today Reno, Nevada. They were almost completely out of food, and what oxen remained were utterly exhausted. Incredibly, 3 days later, one of the men sent ahead to Fort Sutter returned with 7 mules loaded with beef and flour, 2 Indian guides, and news of a different path through the mountains. The new path was difficult but was clear and would see the party through safely. The caravan then camped for 5 days in order to rest their exhausted animals and prepare for their final push. The decision to wait and rest, however, would prove to be fatal. The wagon train pushed forward to the base of the summit to the mountains, and here George Donner's wagon axle broke and forced him to fall behind along with 22 others who would help him with the repairs. The group pressed on, but snow began to fall, and the 2 Indian guides along with one of the party members pressed forward to judge the quality of the trail. As the 3 made it to the summit on horseback, they were unable to press forward any further due to the heavy snowfall, and on their way they discovered that 5 feet of snow had already buried their original tracks. The party retreated to the eastern end of a lake that would come to be known as Donner Lake and built cabins to house the group, hoping that the early snow would eventually melt and let them pass to the other side of the mountains. 6 miles behind the main group, the Donners were forced to build shelters from tents, quilts, buffalo robes, and brush. The group would eventually make 2 attempts to cross the summit, but 20 feet of snow trapped them on the wrong side of the Sierra Nevadas. To their horror, the settlers realized that they were effectively snowed in and began to build shelters to last the winter. On the other side of the mountains, James Reed and the other party member who had been sent ahead to look for supplies tried to trek up the mountains from the opposite side in order to rescue their families. Unfortunately, as they made their way up the mountains, the falling rain became snow, and just 12 miles from the summit, they were unable to go any further. The two returned to Sutter's Fort hoping to recruit more men and supplies for the rescue, but the American-Mexican War had already drawn away most of the men. The Donner Party was stuck and would have to last the winter on dwindling supplies. Realizing that their supplies would never last the winter, the caravan sent a group of 5 men, 9 women, and 1 child to attempt to make the summit on foot. Their meager rations ran out on the 6th day, and yet the group continued to brave high winds and freezing weather. One member, Charles Stanton, fell out of the group, utterly exhausted and snowblind, and implored the rest to press on without him. He would never be seen again either. And soon after, 4 others would die. With no other choice, the group was forced to cannibalize the dead and press on, carrying strips of frozen human meat in their pouches to munch on as they delved ever deeper into the mountains. By the time the group had made it to the other side of the mountains on January 19, 1847, 8 of the party had died, and 7 had been cannibalized by the survivors. Those that had made it across the mountains, however, managed to rally others to send rescue expeditions. On February 5th, the first rescue party of 7 was sent into the mountains, and on February 19th, reached the lake. The camp was in such disrepair that the men believed the camp to be deserted, until a skeletal figure appeared from out of the snow. 12 of the survivors were already dead and 48 remained, with many of them having gone crazy or barely clinging to life. Because the small rescue party had not been able to bring any pack animals with them, they were unable to give the survivors many supplies and were only able to guide 23 refugees back to safety. En route, 2 of the children would end up dying, however. By the time that the Donners and the main group was rescued, evidence of wide-scale cannibalism showed that many of the dead had been eaten by the survivors. A full 2/3 of the men had died, while 2/3 of the women and children had lived, the men giving up their rations and winter clothing for the women and children. Of those who had set out on Hastings' foolhardy route, 41 died and 46 survived, nearly half the group wiped out to starvation, disease, and exposure. Stories of the Donner Party's tragedy spread around the nation via newspaper, with many readers blaming the settlers for their own foolhardiness. In the end, Hastings was never held responsible for any deaths, though immigration to California fell off steeply after news of the tragedy, only to pick back up after news of a gold rush swept the United States. How would you have survived if stuck in the mountains with no food for the winter? Do you think cannibalism is ever okay? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.